If we live long enough, neurodegeneration is coming for us all. And that's because biomarkers of neurodegeneration increases during aging. And one example of that is shown here. This is neurofilament light chain, or NFL, plotted against age on the X. And then we can see that this biomarker that's related to neurodegeneration increases during aging. Well, let's take a sidestep. What is NFL? Neurofilament light chain, or NFL, is a biomarker of injury to the axon, which precedes neurodegeneration, which is what we'll see here. This is an image of a neuron. So as I mentioned, when there's injury to the axon, neurofilaments are released where they can be detected in the blood. So NFL is one example of that. NFL is particularly important because it's also an important predictor of longevity, which is what we'll see in data from this paper. So in this paper, they looked at data from UK Biobank, about 45,000 people, and they used a plasma proteomic approach to derive organ aging models. What that means is they took a blood sample, they looked at as many circulating proteins as possible, and note that albumin and globulin are not included. They're at such a high concentration that their signal would dwarf everything else. So this is with albumin and globulin removed, and this is looking at low abundance proteins in blood. So then they took all of the proteins that they can measure in blood and they derived organ aging clocks, including organ aging clocks for the intestine, kidney, muscle, heart, brain, and not shown here, the immune system. And then of all of these organ system clocks, they found that the organ aging clocks related to the brain and immune system were most strongly associated with health span and longevity. Longevity in this study was defined as maximally reduced all-cause mortality risk during a 17-year follow-up. When people entered the study, who was alive and who had died a median of 17 years later. With that in mind, which proteins were associated with brain age? That's what we'll see here in this plot. For proteins that are to the right of 0, that means that higher levels of the protein were associated with an older brain age. For data that's to the left of 0, so the horizontal bars being to the left of 0, those proteins were associated with a younger brain age. Now, before jumping too deep into this data, I should mention that this is the plasma proteomic clock for predicting brain age. Ideally, we would want to measure all of the proteins, but plasma proteomics, as I'm making this video, is not commercially available, so that's impossible for now. But potentially good news is that the top protein is NEFL, which is neurofilament light chain. And we can see that relatively higher levels of NFL are associated with an older brain age. One could even make the argument that NFL, of all of the proteins on this list, may be most predictive of having an older brain age because its correlation with brain age was amongst the strongest on this list. So with that in mind, can we track NFL? And we can. So it's currently offered by ultalabtest.com. And if you want to help support the channel, you can do that when using the affiliate link in the video's description. I should mention this is a very expensive test. So I'm not using this myself. That's actually my entire budget for a single blood test with just one biomarker. So I find a lot more value in measuring a lot of stuff or trying to get as much other stuff measured, as we'll see later in the video. So with that in mind, how am I tracking NFL? I'm doing it indirectly, and that's with the ratio for kynurenine divided by tryptophan, which is associated with NFL, as shown here. So on the y-axis, we've got plasma levels of the kynurenine to tryptophan ratio, or kyn divided by TRP, and that's plotted against circulating levels of NFL. And then we can see that there's a significant positive correlation. In other words, when the kynurenine to tryptophan ratio is relatively high, that's significantly correlated with high NFL, bad news, or potentially bad news. On the other hand, when this ratio is low, that's significantly correlated with lower NFL, which would be potentially good news. Let's take a sidestep though, because this may be a new concept that many people aren't aware of. What is the kynurenine to tryptophan ratio? So starting with the amino acid tryptophan, that can be degraded into kynurenine by one of two enzymes. In the liver, TDO, and by immune cells, IDO, or immune activation, or immune-related components that are shown here, including interferons, or IFN, gamma, alpha, and beta, the bacterial metabolite lipopolysaccharide, and additionally on that list is the pro-inflammatory cytokine, or protein, TNF-alpha. So we can see that metabolites and pro-inflammatory proteins can induce activation of IDO1, thereby leading to a higher ratio of kynurenine divided by tryptophan. On the other hand, there are also anti-inflammatory proteins like the interleukins IL-10 and IL-4 and superoxide dismutase, or SOD, which is an antioxidant enzyme. So collectively, these three inhibit IDO, thereby reducing the ratio of kynurenine divided by tryptophan. So collectively, we can see that this ratio is an integrated measure of inflammation, antioxidant defense, and potentially also neurodegeneration. and it can be tracked and potentially optimized. And to do that, I'm using at-home metabolomics using Iola's metabolomic kit, which includes data for kynurenine and tryptophan, but also 621 other metabolites. If you want to use this kit yourself, discount link in the video's description. All right, so what's my data? So now we're going to take a look at this ratio, kynurenine divided by tryptophan, for 22 tests from 2023 through 2025. And I should mention, test number 23 results are in. I haven't posted those data yet. If you're interested in seeing those data, I'd recommend checking us out on Patreon. All right, so all of my data for the kynurenine to tryptophan ratio, which is on the y-axis, is shown here. Over the first 5 tests in 2023, average kynurenine to tryptophan ratio was 0.024. Then over 9 tests, the next year, 2024, it was 0.023. And over 8 tests in 2025, it was 0.02. We can see that there's a decline in that ratio over this 2+ year span, which then raises the question of what's optimal for this ratio. And to address that, I have a new Patreon tier dedicated specifically to what's optimal for biomarkers, including a new recent addition of neurodegeneration versus neurogenesis related biomarkers. Now for neurogenesis, B2M qualifies, but also I'm going to add the kynurenine to tryptophan ratio. As we just saw, it's associated with NFL, which is a biomarker of neurodegeneration. In addition to the biomarker shown here, it currently includes almost 2.5 hours of video content, more than 57 published references, and note that these aren't the LLMs or reference ranges that you can get from the LLMs. This is what may be optimal based on how each of these biomarkers changes during aging, so i.e. what's found in youth or more likely to be found in youth, but also their association with risk of death for all causes. I've put all that data together in video format to derive what's optimal for each of these biomarkers. So if you're interested in that, check it out. Without giving away the full story, we know from the plot I just showed, lower is better, or lower might be better for kynurenine divided by tryptophan based on its correlation with neurofilament light chain. If we extrapolate based on the trend line, then data somewhere around 0.013 may be optimal, as that will be the lowest kynurenine to tryptophan ratio, and that would also be associated with the lowest NFL. But note that there's only 3 data points that extrapolation is based on. All right, so let's take it a step back. We can now evaluate where my data lies on this plot. So we can see that it was relatively high, and that would be bad news. But the good news is that I've been able to move it in the right direction over the past 2+ year period. But if we extrapolate based on the trend line, I should go lower, probably somewhere around 0.016. So that will be close to my target for what's optimal. And without going to the what's optimal tier on Patreon, I know I'm giving away the milk without buying the cow. I get that. My optimal range there too, based on how kynurenine and tryptophan changes during aging and its association with all-cause mortality risk, that data fits within that. But if you want to see the actual data, I'd recommend checking us out on Patreon. All right, so what can I do to further reduce this ratio so to get it from 0.02 even lower? The first and obvious question would be, what do LLMs say? And if you're not already doing that, I recommend all of us do that. I find it incredibly useful to start off there, to see what it says. It's basically like an upgraded version of PubMed. It's not perfect, it still makes mistakes, it still leaves out papers that I know of, that it doesn't know of, that I have to prompt to tell me about, but it's much better than PubMed if you're generally using it for a search. Unfortunately, when you do that search, and maybe some of you already left the video to go do the search and see what it says, you're going to get general recommendations. Diet, exercise, weight loss. This is already well known. I'm trying to make further gains beyond just general recommendations. With that in mind, what do correlations within my own data say for this ratio with diet? I'm not going to go through all of the correlations, but one of the strongest correlations is for the kynurenine to tryptophan ratio with monounsaturated fat. And if you want to see the full list of correlations, that's on the correlations tier on Patreon. And note that this isn't just correlations with the kynurenine to tryptophan ratio. It's with around 30 other standard clinical chemistry biomarkers, and then all metabolomic data, 623 metabolites, correlations with diet. So if you're interested in that, check it out. So in terms of its correlation with monounsaturated fat, we've got the kynurenine to tryptophan ratio on the y-axis, and that's plotted against the average daily monounsaturated fatty acid intake, or MUFA, on the x. And for those who are unfamiliar, I've tracked diet using a food scale going back to 2015. More than 99% of the diet has been weighed. I then enter that data into a diet tracking app. I then pull those data into a spreadsheet. So now every blood test has a corresponding average dietary intake, and I can look at correlations within my own data to try to figure out what the signal is while trying to minimize the noise. And I try to figure out the story in my own data based on these correlations. In the plot, we can see that significant inverse correlation. The correlation coefficient is -0.47, and that p-value is less than 0.05 at 0.03. But note that there may be a single time point that's pulling this correlation in that direction. It may be an outlier. So to address that, I'm going to try to fill in the empty spots. And with that in mind, for the next test, test number 24, current MUFA intake or average MUFA intake since the January 30th test is about 35 grams per day. If it's a real correlation, we'd expect to see data that's close to around 0.19 or 0.18 based on extrapolation of the trend line. That will also help to fill in that area where I don't yet have any data. If it's not a real correlation, we'd expect to see this correlation weaken, so the correlation coefficient won't be negative 0.47, it'll probably be negative 0.35, something weaker. Other stuff will pop up, and then I'll try to follow that, and I'll continue to do that over and over and over until I can figure out the recipe for what may help keep this ratio relatively low. Will it work? The next test is scheduled for March 18th, so if you're interested in those data, note that it takes about a month for the metabolomic data to come in. So if you're interested in those data, check us out on Patreon around April. That's when I first post it. I don't always make videos that make it onto YouTube for metabolomic data. So if you want to see the data, both the raw data and my correlations and the plan for what I plan on doing for helping to improve biomarkers, check us out on Patreon, where you can see those biomarker correlations. I also offer blood test consults, and I post at least twice per day in 3 other Patreon tiers. We've also got a whole bunch of discount and affiliate links that you can use to test yourself that help support the channel, including ultralabtest.com, which is where I get the majority of my blood tests done. If you use LabCorp, you can also use the affiliate link for life extension. So now we've got both bases covered. If you want to help support the channel, you can do that with Quest Labs using ultralabtest.com. Or if there's a LabCorp in your area, you can use life extension. I'm also using, and there are affiliate links correspondingly, at-home metabolomics, as mentioned in the video, NAD testing with Infinity, I measured more than 30 times, epigenetic testing with True Diagnostic, at-home blood testing with SciFox Health, oral microbiome composition, diet tracking with Chronometer, green tea, the clearly filtered water filter, or if you want to support the channel, or if you'd like to help support the channel, you can do that with the website Buy Me a Coffee. We've also got merch, including Data is my North Star, Figuring Stuff Out is my drug, which I've got on here, or the ConquerAging or Dietary logo. Link in the video's description. Thanks for watching. I hope that you enjoyed the video. Have a great day.